Okay, so we had an API review done. Michelle looked at our cap request, our enhancement request, and today I'd like to just go over the comments and hear your perspective on it, and help me answer some of the questions that are here too. Let me start by sharing my screen. All right, so I'm just going to quickly go over all the unresolved comments as of right now. So Blaine, did I answer your question correctly? Oh, yeah, this is not a question. Yeah, I fixed it. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go over comments that are simply suggestions, or simple responses. I think in this case we can add this information in the protocol spec, and I think I've done it, but let's keep going. Okay, so this is a feature request that we had early on. I want to go over this quickly, and Jeff brought it back up in his review a few weeks back. So when creating a bucket, Red Hat and Jeff, who's from Red Hat, and a bunch of others from Red Hat also wanted a mechanism to provide a prefix for that bucket. The reason is whenever a bucket is created by Cozy, it uses a UUID or a generated name, and for management purposes, if you wanted to have a human readable name to that bucket, some form of identifier, we thought of the idea of having a prefix. But later on we decided that it's probably it shouldn't be a part of, I mean, it need not be a part of the first version of the API. The main reason being, having a prefix is still limiting. It can't be changed. It's probably better if we have some form of label is what we thought, and we decided maybe we shouldn't go like a,
I agree with that. I think I was probably one of the ones arguing against using a prefix and
yeah,
in favor of some sort of label or metadata.
right.
Because you have the same issue with volumes, and the only solution is to store metadata in the underlying storage system rather than relying on Kubernetes object names.
Right. Right.
When you're talking about a label here, it seems like you're talking about a Kubernetes label, unless you're talking about like a metadata on the bucket itself, like in the
metadata on the bucket itself.
Okay.
So like the specific Cozy driver should have access to information that it can then store in whatever vendor specific way it wants to on the bucket itself. And then if you want to do auditing or tracking or cost center analysis, whatever it is you want to do with that information, you have it on the bucket.
Right. What if the backend does not support metadata on buckets, or is that something that's ubiquitous?
I mean, that seems like a limitation of that backend, right? File an RFE and fix it if it matters.
Gotcha. I'm just trying to understand kind of the trade-offs here, and
So the cloud providers at least provide a mechanism to specify some sort of metadata. In case of something like Minio, we don't have that. However, we don't see such a request coming in, and we could add it just as quickly. Where I'm coming from is the S3 protocol, which Minio speaks, does not have a standard for specifying metadata. And I assume the other two major protocols, Azure and GCP, they also don't have a standard for specifying metadata. That being said, they all have mechanisms to do it. So the driver could still do it if it wanted to. But on-prem solutions, I'm fairly certain that none of them have this mechanism.
But it shouldn't be part of the S3 standard, because this isn't information you want to make available to the consumer of the
Of course, yeah,
of the bucket. This is administrative information that an administrator might want to have access to.
right. Right. I mean, create bucket is a part of S3 standard. So that's where I was coming from. It's reasonable to think, it's a part of the creation process. But you're right. S3 shouldn't care about administrative stuff. The protocol standard itself.
Even driver can decide like whether it need to add some
Right.
prefix or not, right? Like it's
Yeah.
driver's act. Like if there's a configuration option in driver and say I need to create something like that, like
Hmm.
it can be option for driver itself, right? Like if needed.
Yeah, and the driver can come up with any naming scheme it wants. If some kind of I mean, it can be a contract between the user and the driver. So, for instance, the driver could say, specify this label, and we'll use that as a bucket identifier or some part of the bucket. Like in volumes we have topology to say, this volume belongs to this rack or this colo or whatever. Um, so similar to that, we could have. I mean, the users could have a contract with the driver itself rather than through Cozy.
Yeah, I think the this is something that is like that can be totally viewed as like an implementation that the backend needs to deal with. This is something that we've seen with Ceph, kind of using the predecessor to Cozy, the like lib bucket provisioner library that Ceph currently doesn't have a way of like tagging buckets with information. And so there's like a corner case where one could, say manually create a bucket in the backend as a like I can just manually create it. And then I can specify a like Cozy bucket like in a brownfield use case. And maybe like the conversation has evolved a little bit. There were like a couple of months of meetings I wasn't able to attend, where then you could say, oh, I want to create a like a bucket for this like manual bucket that exists, and so the backend is like, well, this bucket already exists, so I don't need to do anything. But then when that bucket is deleted, then the previously user created bucket could be deleted by the lib bucket provisioner. And so there is some benefit to being able to, for some benefit for the backend to be able to understand, was this a bucket originally created by Cozy, or was this a something that was created by the user?
Mm-hmm.
So I
mhm.
think maybe this is the intention behind this like request, although I also certainly I understand, and I'm not like trying to push against like having a prefix be necessary.
The issue you're raising, which is accidental deletion of like brownfield buckets, that's handled by the deletion policy.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. We very specifically support a case where like the user deletes their bucket claims. That's what we're calling it, right?
Mhm.
Right.
And we never call delete on the Cozy driver because there's a policy that says don't do that. And the idea is, if you're importing brownfield buckets that you don't want to get deleted by Kubernetes, then you just set that deletion policy to retain, and then people can delete them and they won't go away. And so
Right.
the for that specific case, the metadata required to do the right thing is in Kubernetes.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess there's also like kind of a consideration of like that assumes like the user is doing that like with intention and not accidentally specifying a bucket that already exists that they don't
Well,
understand.
but a user can't directly import a brownfield bucket either. So an administrator would have had to be involved, or a controller acting on behalf of the administrator. And you could set up a policy that says every brownfield bucket created in this way will have the retention policy set to retain. Therefore, it's impossible to do the wrong thing.
Okay. So Cozy already kind of has planned workflow around the scenario of
Yeah, because
trying
you don't
to-
want to delete a brownfield bucket that you just tried to import for usage, but not for management.
Right.
So that's what the deletion policy is for.
Gotcha. Okay. And because a user can't just go and create the bucket itself from a brownfield case, then we shouldn't like need to plan for like users accidentally trying to clobber even other users' buckets.
Yeah, if the Cozy sidecar calls the delete bucket, it's because you really wanted to delete that bucket. You can trust that that's an intentional action.
Okay, cool. I appreciate like re-clarifying.
No worries. All right, so our stance is still the same. We don't have a prefix field or anything. And if someone still wants to have it, it can be a contract between the driver and the user. Okay. All right, the next one. Earlier draft defined bucket ID as the name of the backend bucket. In this version, I don't see where an admin can see the name of the backend bucket. Maybe this simply isn't needed for any admin use cases. I see. I need to go see what he's talking about. Yeah, Jifren, this needs to be removed. All right, so let's go all the way down. I believe the bucket ID is still inside the status. So once the bucket is created, is that here? I think maybe we, if I remember correctly, I think we got to a point where we said the bucket name is the bucket ID. The name of the bucket defined here is the bucket ID. And because of that, there's no need to have a separate identifier for the bucket ID. Oh, we still have it.
Yeah, the bucket name is the name of the bucket object, but then the driver gets to return a handle, I guess, which we're calling the ID.
Right.
And then that gets stored. And then from that point on, Cozy refers to it by ID instead of by name. So the name is only for item potency.
It's going to the link.
And kind of like on the topic of, so this is on a bucket, correct? Not on a bucket request.
I think we're calling it
Yeah.
a bucket,
Or a bucket
claim now.
rather.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. The user chooses the name of the bucket claim, and then the Kubernetes will, or Cozy will create a bucket with a different name, and then that's the name that the Cozy driver will see. Cozy driver never sees the user's name, the name the user chose, because it's irrelevant.
And Cozy chooses the ID of the bucket as well.
Well, the driver chooses the ID of the bucket.
Yeah. So the user chooses the name of the bucket claim. Cozy chooses the name of the bucket, which becomes the bucket name that gets passed down to the Cozy driver. The driver chooses the ID, and then Cozy stores that ID and refers to it by the ID thereafter.
Okay. So the process is to like call to the driver and then once the driver returns with some success, then Cozy creates the bucket object in Kubernetes.
So the
Well,
bucket
it's
is created first, and but the ID is empty until that create succeeds.
Okay, so should that parameter be in the status then instead of in the spec?
that's a good question. So we kind of went back and forth on this a little bit. Bucket ID can be, should be specified when it's a brownfield bucket,
Okay,
and in that case it becomes a spec field. It's not a status field.
right,
Uh,
definitely.
yeah, and that's and there was another conversation about a different resource, where say for instance the IP address of a pod, which is determined dynamically, is actually a spec field, and using that as an example, we justified that in this case it makes sense to have bucket ID as a spec field.
Sid, I think it makes sense to have it in both. That's what we do in the snapshot case, actually.
Oh,
Because,
really?
yeah, like in the status field, so it should always be in the status field, because that's, when you return, you get that ID. Then in the spec field, if it's a brown field, right, you need that in the spec field. That's the only time you need that in the spec field, which is the brown field case, right? Or is that the other way?
Yeah.
I was trying to see, because a bucket. Right. So this is this the one that returned by the driver, right? The bucket ID.
Right. This is
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah. So what we did in the snapshot case is that ID is always in the status for both brown field and green field, and then then that's only in the spec. I think it's believe it's in brown field case that you already know that ahead of time.
Okay. So should we have different names for it? Is there
Right.
as
I
a
think
user,
probably should have different names. I was just trying to see what it's
create,
better, easier to have, if you have different name, will be easier.
right? Because if coming from the perspective of a user, like if I were to see two fields in both spec and status with the same name, it's always it's unintuitive. I can't. Very few people are going to read the API definitions. So
Right. So in our case, it's pretty clear, because we actually have a source field. Right. So we have a source field, and then this source can be either, like in our case, it's the snapshot, right? So the source could either be a volume handle, that's dynamic provisioning, or it could be a snapshot handle, that's the static provision, that's the brownfield case. So it's very clear it's part of the source. That's in the spec, which is in the spec, and in the status is just called a snapshot handle. So the field itself, it's all called snapshot handle. It's just one is inside to the source, so it's very clear that what that means.
okay, so I have some proposals for names. Then I think I'm convinced on having two fields as long as they have different names. So source bucket ID and created bucket ID. It's not a symmetrical name as in source and created.
I wonder. I do sort of like the idea that Dishing sort of brought up from like prior experience of having a sort of source like sub spec, where we can choose, like, is the source of this bucket like a new creation, or is the source a pre-existing bucket? If it ends up being just like one field of difference, that might be a little heavy-handed. Otherwise, I might propose like pre-existing bucket ID for the spec, and then the status. I think bucket ID is probably
sufficient.
We don't.
Yeah.
So for the dynamic case, we don't really have a source, isn't it? This is new, right? This is not the same as the snapshot case. The source is the volume handle. In this case, you don't really have a source. It's dynamic provisioning, right? So basically, it's only in the brownfield case you have this source, right? Because in our case, we actually have 2 field. You can only choose one in that source, right? So in this case, it looks like it's just one thing.
Right. Yeah, there's only one field,
right.
and I think I understand what Blaine, I think, was speaking, is trying to say. For a second, I even thought we could have like a compound resource, like something like a structure where it's not flat anymore, but a structure that says bucket source, dynamic or static, and the bucket ID. But then that brings back the question of spec versus status all over again. I mean, I think as a simple next step, we could just have it be bucket ID, and
So I think this field basically will only be populated if it's the static provisioning in the spec, basically. If it's a dynamic provisioning, then this field will not be used, right?
So, yeah. I think then in that case, let's keep it simple until we get a better solution.
Yeah,
let's
so
just
like pre-existing, that's fine. I think I think the name, just maybe choose a different name, maybe it makes more sense in this case, since you only have this for dynamic, for the static case.
So I'm coming. Okay, so let me say it like this. So the point or the purpose of this API is to intuitively convey to the user what it's meant for, and for the sake of spec and status, if we were to have it in 2 places, I think we're adding more confusion. Would it be better to just leave it here, just have it in spec?
Well, but then where do you have this field? If dynamic provisioning case, where do you have this? You don't really have this field at all, or is that populated later?
Yeah, we populate later.
That's not good. I think that's the design in the existing PV. I think that's actually very confusing. I think it's actually still better. It's more clean to have that in both places. It's very clear that the spec that's where you want it, right? So it's never going to be changed. The status will be the one that will be changed by the controller. Okay. Otherwise, this one field can be changed by 2 different things. One is the controller, one is the admin. That's actually not very confusing. That's why we actually did that in the snapshot.
Oh, I see. Yeah, because they can support each other.
For what it's worth, I agree with Xing's sentiment also. In the current, in the lib bucket provisioner design, it uses something like this where bucket ID is in the spec. And we've gotten lots of we've seen in Slack, lots of Rook users have been confused about how to know what their bucket is called when it exists, when it is like populated after the fact in the spec rather than in the status. So I think having the bucket ID be reflected in the status is a lot less confusing for users. And also, like, when that appears in the status, it is like, it implicitly kind of suggests that the bucket is ready, or at least exists in the backend.
Right, and also this way you clearly know, even after it's provisioned, you can tell whether it's dynamically or statically provisioned, because otherwise, like in the PVPVC case, when it's bound, you can never tell whether that's a static or dynamic provisioned, because this field, don't know who fills it.
That's true.
Yeah,
that is true. Okay. No, my only requirement is that we're clear to the user, and also the API satisfies all our technical needs. So coming from that perspective, I would like suggestions on the name then. So for in the spec, maybe we don't call it bucket ID. In the status, we can leave it as bucket ID, and in the spec, should we call it as source bucket ID?
Requested bucket ID or?
Well, not requested, right? Because it's the bucket ID of an existing bucket.
Right, so it's either just existing bucket ID or something, maybe that's pretty clear. Source is fine too, but source,
It doesn't sound right somehow.
yeah, I just feel like if you have source, then people already think the dynamic case should also have a source. But if you say pre-existing, then it's pretty clear
Yeah.
that's pre-existing.
How about just existing bucket ID?
Existing. That's probably, yeah, fine too. Existing, it's already there, basically meaning it's very clear, right? So it's already there.
Sure, yeah. Static? Anything to do with
Static,
static?
I thought it like we are actually trying to avoid saying this word in in for the like a PVC or for the snapshot, we actually stop saying that word. We just use pre-provisioned. I actually don't know the reason, but Michelle keeps saying don't say static anymore, just to say pre-provisioned.
I see.
So we try not to use static anymore.
Okay. Okay, existing bucket ID sounds pretty good to me, actually.
Yeah, fine.
All right. So in the spec, we can call it, I'm just writing it down here. In the spec, we can call it existing bucket ID. And the status, it's just bucket ID, right?
Right, that should be fine.
And in case of brownfield buckets, existing buckets, will we fill the status bucket ID as well?
Right, both will be filled.
Okay. Okay.
Uh,
Do we need to?
Yes, the status field should have both.
I mean,
Yeah,
The status field should always have the bucket ID field.
I also agree with that. I think like the status is the place where we want users to go to get information about how to like, or administrators or whatever to get information about how to like connect to the bucket or possibly do like backend management of the bucket. If we make like some custom logic for users or admins to figure out that is dependent on what the type is, then I think it will end up confusing people. It's a lot easier to create tooling if it's always populated in the status.
Okay. Yeah. I can see that. Makes sense.
Yeah, so just to be clear, like I just got a bit confused. So in the spec field, the existing bucket ID points to the name given from the user or like who it is, and the
And
status field has the backend bucket name, actual bucket name, which was created in the backend, right? Oh,
um so no so suspect so when creating a bucket, the user creates the bucket claim, and that is where they provide that is the only name that the user gives now.
okay.
And then Cozy creates a bucket by UUID, and if Cozy is creating the bucket, then this field will be left empty. In the spec, it will be left empty. And in the status field, we are adding a new under status, we're adding a new field called bucket ID. The same thing goes into the status. And here we're going to rename this to existing bucket ID.
Okay.
So if there is an existing bucket that the admin wants to use via Cozy, they would fill in this field. But regardless of how the bucket is provisioned, either by creating a bucket claim or by the admin creating this bucket object, the status field's bucket ID will always be filled.
Okay, and actually both are the same value, like there's no
Right.
difference. Okay.
No.
So I have follow-up question, like so while admin is creating for the brownfield case, if admin is creating the bucket resource, then should he need to know about the backend bucket name, or it's not needed? The driver will figure that out.
So if the admin is creating a bucket of for an existing bucket, right, a bucket object for they would need to know the backend bucket name.
They
And
need to know.
they would need to, yes.
So if it is not available, how he can know the backend bucket name? Like that was one of the.
Okay, so is your question, so let's define the scenario. Are you saying there is a bucket already existing in the backend, correct?
Yeah, okay, just consider the scenario. I have created a bucket claim and I got a bucket.
Oh, I
And
see.
for our use case, like if I need to have a copy of a bucket on a different namespace, like that was a discussion which we have made, right?
Mhm.
For that case, do I need to have the backend bucket name or not? That was my question.
No, you don't. You don't.
I don't.
So no, you don't.
Okay.
So if I understand your question correctly, so you're saying we create a bucket using the bucket claim cozy provisioning process.
Mm,
Um, in that case, does the bucket name need to be specified by the admin or the user in any situation? The answer is no.
okay. Sure.
Yeah, they don't have to know.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, so let's go to the next comment. I've written down whatever we concluded, and I hope if anyone has any questions or clarifications, please feel free to ask at any point. Um, yeah, we like to have very open discussions here. There's no, we don't have a structured meeting for one good reason. It's so that everyone can participate easily. Um, at least until we get to a more standardized API. This is how we plan to run it. Um, okay, so this we just resolved it. I will respond to Jeff shortly. Implicit in this is that the field must be omitted and bucket name filled in order to access a bucket creator. Oh, I think this is the same question you're asking. Bucket access. Okay, so what Jeff is saying here. Yeah, Jeff is talking about the use case, exactly what you brought up. Is this what you were bringing up, Jeffin? As in, if the bucket was created in a different namespace, then this would be empty, and they'd have to set the bucket name
Oh,
of
okay.
the.
I was not aware of this, like this part.
Okay,
In bucket access, you need to mention the bucket name. I
okay.
thought if okay. I was referring to same scenario. So for that scenario, this is mentioning about bucket access, right? I
Mhm.
want to see how the bucket resource will be created. That's what my question was.
Makes sense. Okay, so there's a spelling mistake here, but I did this. But I think he's just saying improve the comments and make it clearer rather than implicit. Should be service account name. This should also be optional, right? Yes, this should be optional. So they're talking about this field here. Access class. There it is. Yeah, credentials, secret name, service account name is the name of the service account that Cozy will. Oh, yeah. There's another mistake. This should be service account name. But service account name is the name of the Cozy map. Yeah, this is optional. So there are two kinds of authentication. One is using access key and secret key. The other is using service accounts where the service account tokens are mapped to um, users or some sort of IAM roles in the backend, and um, someone who's requesting access simply just specifies a service account, and then they just implicitly get access. This form of access control allows us to do credential rotation more easily. Do Yeah, that's basically one of the main advantages. Instead of doing access keys and secret keys, yeah, authentication is provided by a service account. All right, so yeah, the question was, is it optional? Yes. If you're doing it through access key and secret key, it's this won't be specified. If you're doing access control or access control through service accounts, then access key, secret key will be optional. So both of these fields can be made optional.
Okay, and both can be used simultaneously as well. They're not mutually exclusive.
They are mutually exclusive, actually. But I can't think of a situation where you'd want both. Or how would that even work? Because someone would have to, you would only need to authenticate one way to access the backend.
No, like we had a discussion on this thing, right? Both can be the right, as far as I remember. Ben, do you recollect? Like at that point we had discussed like both can be the, like the information will be the on the JSON file or like whatever file which we are mounting, and client can choose to for the compatibility or like backward compatibility issue. Like that's
I thought that the client is required to support all of the types of authentication, and we would never send down more than one, because if we
okay.
did send down more than one, how would they know what to do?
Okay, fine.
We want to be unambiguous and say, you know, I mean, we should. I think Sid was arguing for a mechanism to prefer one over the other if you want to, but then when you actually create a bucket access object, it's only going to be the one that you requested, and the workloads are required to support both.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
Follow-up question on this. I guess I was asking it. It seems to me that when there are mutually exclusive configuration options, it can be helpful to have them exist in a like sub-spec. I don't. Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly open to like differing opinions on that, but I wonder if nesting them under a like authentication method or some sort of sub-spec could be helpful, and then that spec could be explained like pick one of these other, pick one of these methods, and only one. I know we don't.
You mean fields, not methods, right?
Yeah, but they
it's a
are
field of the
effectively
object.
they are effectively also methods
authentication
as well.
methods, right?
Right. One is like by secret. One is
in the
by
Kubernetes
service
object,
account.
there would be a field called authentication that would be like a discriminated union, which is one of the following things.
Right.
Yeah. That would be cleaner from a data representation point of view.
Would it also help the user experience? Yeah. I mean, I think it can also lead to more errors because they might specify the wrong authentication method and then specify the wrong field.
No. I mean, if we did this, there would have to be whatever was doing the validation would just validate this.
Right.
The thing that was validating objects would just look at the discriminated union and make sure exactly one submember was filled in, and if it was 0 or 2, it would fail.
Yeah, I guess my opinion is that having a like a subfield that is a discriminated union is a better experience for users, because otherwise they kind of see that there are two fields and they're both optional. A user might fill in neither, or they might try to fill in both. And if both aren't supported, then I feel like it's easier to explain that when they're part of a sub-spec rather than when they're part of a much larger overall spec.
Okay, there's two things here. One is add something like authentication. Oh, we do have it. We have this. So we have this in the class though, because we wanted to specify it. Yeah. Now, so we were convinced on that. So the question now is about having a nested field or just having it be flat. I think flat is okay, but if nesting it would make it clearer, sure, why not? I don't know if I see a huge difference in value, but I'm open to other opinions, and you can convince me otherwise. I'm strictly coming from the point of a user that's going to create this resource. Would they benefit from knowing or having these two fields be nested rather than just flat under spec? That's the one remaining question, right?
This is a field that's populated by the controller, isn't it? It's the actual credential.
Oh, I'm talking about this field, these two.
Oh, sorry, I don't have my phone in front of me.
Oh, credential secret name and credential answer service account name.
Oh, right. So, yes, I had hoped that the controller could fill all this stuff in, but for reasons you explained, the user has to fill those in. Yeesh. Well, if so, for the ones the user has to fill in, you always have to fill them in, right? The credential secret name, you always
Well, that or the
populate.
service account name, one of them has to be specified.
No, the credentials secret name has to be specified no matter what, because it's the secret that we're going to plumb whatever the credential is into. Because there's got to be a secret inside the pod so that the object client knows what to do.
If there
Yeah,
is a
that's true.
go ahead, Jiffin.
Yeah, that's true. I yeah, we misspelled or like misunderstood that. Sorry.
I don't. Can you speak up? Sorry, I couldn't.
Sorry. Yeah, like we measured the context for credential secret name. Sorry. No, like Ben was saying, what Ben was saying is correct. Like we discuss about different topics. That's what I was pointing to. Sorry.
Yeah, but for this field, you always have to fill it in. Same thing with service account, because it's what the user is requesting is there's going to be a secret name that's going to be the same the secret name that's in their pod, which is where they're going to get their cozy bucket information, the bucket.json effectively. And the service account name is also non-optional because you don't know what the driver is going to do with it. It might ignore it, but it might use it. So it has to match.
All right. So yeah, credential secret name is for bucket info.json. Fair enough. And service account name. Why is that mandatory?
Because some drivers might only support IAM-based authentication.
But for those that don't, do we need to fill it in?
They don't need to, but that's the whole thing. The user doesn't know what the driver is. The user's making a request with zero knowledge of what's on the back end. They don't know if the service account's going to get ignored or if it's going to get used. So they have to specify it on the chance that it gets used.
Right, and with the possibility that the backend could be updated to use a different authentication method in the future, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, and because these are going to be Kubernetes objects, people are going to build workflows around them that are meant to be portable, which means that they have to work across multiple drivers. So it's not okay just to say, oh, I know that my particular backend doesn't use service accounts, therefore I'm going to leave it blank. Because if someone else tries to use it and they leave it blank, it might not work for them. And this, by the way, is one of the things I really don't like about our current design, but I don't see if we want to support IAM, I don't see a way around this.
The meaning of service account kind of gets lost because many times you'd be specifying it. You don't even have to specify it in the pod and things will still work. It's confusing.
Well, but there is a default service account for the pod. We could do the same thing and say, if you leave it blank, we use the default.
That's fine, yeah.
But I mean, but the point is it's implicitly filled in then.
Yeah, okay. That to me, because if a user is forced to set a secret name and or service account name and it doesn't really get used anywhere, that's just as confusing. Because
but it has to match your pod service account. So like if
not
the pod
really.
has it does, because otherwise you are not portable to a driver that's using IAM.
I agree with that, but if they're not using service account, if they're not using IAM, it doesn't have to match. The pod service account and this service account need not match. It'll still work.
But the user can't know that.
They'll figure it out, and that's when it'll seem like a leaky system actually.
No, I mean,
Mhm.
they can't know it in advance. And when we're talking about automated workflows, there is no figure it out later. You have the workflow and you want to be able to press the button and get the desired result. And the workflow has to just do the thing that's going to work across any implementation, right?
Oh, are you
That's
saying? Oh wait, are you saying? Sorry, are you saying that service account? Are you saying that service account name cannot be known upfront? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that the fact that the service account might be ignored in any particular Kubernetes cluster is something that users can't be aware of on a particular, whether a particular Kubernetes cluster will ignore it or not. So they have to code their workflows in such a way that it's always present. And I agree that you have a default mechanism that says, you can leave it blank and you get basically the same effect as if you left it blank for the pod, but that is the same thing as having specified what the name of the default service account. And if you leave it blank for the bucket access, but don't leave it blank for your pod and they don't end up matching, then that's a bug in the user's workflow, right? Because it might work on some clouds and not work on other clouds.
Right.
So we really have to find a way to ensure that they do match in practice. And this is where our, lack of integration with the pod spec is going to really hurt our design, right? Because if we had kubelet level support for doing the right thing, we could just figure this out, right? We would know what the service account was, and we could check it and we could do all the appropriate things. But because we're separating ourselves from kubelet and forcing people to do this over on the side and then shoving everything into a secret and they have to pull it out of the secret, you have to make this match up manually. And it's gross, but I don't see the alternative.
Fair enough. But we will eventually end up in the kubelet, so there is hope after all.
I hope so.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe it. One day, a few years from now, probably. But yeah. All right. Does that address everyone's questions? So the conclusion to this whole discussion is both of these fields are not optional. The credential secret name has to be specified every single time because it is going to contain the actual secrets inside a it's going to contain a structure called bucketinfo.json, and this structure contains information about the bucket, as in the bucket name, um, the authentication method, the backend URL, access key secret keys if it's access key secret key based authentication, or it's going to have a pointer to uh, the service account saying this is service account based authentication. And the service account name, which is the second field, there's a typo here, but the service account name will be used when the bucket access class has the authentication type set to IAM. And the service account name, we just argued that it has to also be always set in order to be future proof. And what's the word for it?
Portable.
Portable. Yeah, portable. There you go. Thanks, man. All right, so yeah, it should be service account name. All right, we can explain this here. We have only 5 minutes. I think we should end it at this point rather than start a new discussion because I don't want to leave in the middle of one. Since we have only 5 minutes, does anyone have any questions? Anything else that they want to bring up?
So actually, I have like last week I was not there for the meeting, but in the discussion or in the recording, it was mentioned about the reference policy, like it's being moved out, like do we have any concrete on how we are going to share between namespaces or something like that, or like?
Yeah, so let me pull that up from last week. So I actually added the notes of last week's conversation
Yeah.
into the doc that we have, which is pinned to SIG Storage Cozy channel. And yeah, I'm just gonna pull it up quickly to quickly remember what it is that we discussed. Okay. So what we found that reference policy is not being used by the gateway API, and we said we redefined self-service. So reference policy was going to be used to allow people from other namespaces to access buckets created in one namespace, which is really self-serving. And we said we're going to redefine this definition of self-service itself and say that we'll have 3 self-service modes. I mean, I don't know how we'll call it in the API, but just for discussion. One is the same namespace self-service, which is pretty straightforward. One more is all namespaces where a bucket that's created can be specified to be accessible from all namespaces, and because of that, it can just work from all namespaces. The third method is selected namespaces, where if we specify a selector on the bucket saying these are all the places it can be shared or can be used from, then that's how it would be. And all of this would be specified when creating the bucket by the user. So when a user creates the bucket, they would say, hey, you can share it with everyone, you can share it with only these people, or you can share, it is only accessible from within the namespace. So that way we thought of a way to avoid or not use reference policy, not need reference policy anymore.
Okay, so we are also moving away from reference policy, and it's okay. Like, so I guess Tim has suggested to use reference policy. Like, do you get the feedback from them, or like?
Yeah.
Or,
So Tim was coming from, so Tim was saying that Gateway API is facing the same issues we are. Have a look at how they solve it. That's all he was suggesting. He wasn't really pushing for reference policy as much. And Gateway API itself has moved away from it, and haven't really followed up with them on that, but I should. That being said, it is kind of a heavy API. It's simpler to just go with something like a selector.
yeah, that's true. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. There was one request by Michelle, which was pretty interesting. One is protocol being a list. But we said we can create multiple bucket claims or multiple bucket accesses. Can't remember what it was. Workflows. Yeah, so here, has there been any thought on how a retention period for compliance use cases can be supported? Will that conflict with deletion policy? So we at with Minio, with S3, there is you can specify bucket lifecycle, or sorry, object lifecycle. There's also bucket lifecycle where you say that bucket cannot be deleted or an object cannot be deleted until it's been for a month after it's created or something like that. You can also say things like once it's deleted, it goes into kind of a locked mode for a month before it's truly taken out, so you can recover it in the meantime. Stuff like that to prevent accidental deletion exists. And then there's this other policy around ransomware. It's ransomware is where someone within the company which owns the bucket is pissed off at the company or something, and decides to hold the data ransom. So or threatens to delete the data. So against that also we have some policies.
So those kinds of policies should be implemented down at the lowest level possible, like not up at Kubernetes, but down inside the the storage device.
I mean, it can be something, you could argue that it's at the bucket level. Where I'm coming from, this is a S3 standard, not a Minio thing. Where I'm coming from is, I I had these use cases in mind already, but I was kind of punting it for after alpha and basically after V1 even.
But I mean that they can be opaque parameters in your bucket class, and the driver can implement them down in the storage layer however it wants. And then if you get a request to delete a bucket from Kubernetes that conflicts with what the retention policy is, you can just fail the deletion until it no longer conflicts, right?
Yeah, that's
So
completely
we
right.
don't have to do anything at the Kubernetes layer to allow these kinds of things to work.
Yeah, I mean, I would still like to discuss a little bit more when we have more time. But I thought this was an interesting request, coming in so early. But Ben, yeah, your approach should mostly be just enough. You probably don't need more. Anyways, we're 1 minute over time. Thank you, everyone.